Imagine commanding 15,000 men against 100,000 Ottoman soldiers, the terror of three continents, and winning by turning geography into your deadliest weapon. Drowning enemy warriors in 3 feet of marsh water, while their 75-year-old Grand Vizier falls from his horse into the mud and nearly suffocates before being saved by a nameless slave who chose duty over freedom. August 23, 1595. Prince Michael the Brave of Wallachia stood behind a bridge barely 20 feet wide. Knowing that the mathematical impossibility facing him, odds of nearly 7 to 1 could only be overcome by forcing 100,000 enemies to attack through a single choke point surrounded by treacherous marshland that turned armor into a death sentence. Here's what makes this tactically insane. Michael had spent 3 months secretly diverting streams to expand the marsh around Călugăreni, disguising deep mud pools with rushes and branches, positioning 10 to 12 cannons at precisely calculated angles to turn the narrow bridge into a killing gallery where Ottoman soldiers would be compressed into perfect targets. When Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha's vanguard pushed onto that bridge, confident in their numerical superiority and century of victories, they walked into a meat grinder where artillery grapeshot swept men off the wooden structure into the marsh below, where armor dragged them straight to the muddy bottom. By sunset, approximately 10,000 to 20,000 Ottoman casualties littered the battlefield and floated in the Neajlov River, many drowned rather than killed by weapons, versus roughly 1,000 Wallachian dead. The Sultan's sacred banner, never before captured by Christian hands, ended up as a trophy. 6 hours of combat shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility and proved that terrain properly exploited could defeat any numerical advantage. To understand why 100,000 Ottoman soldiers marched into a trap, you need to understand that by 1595, the Ottoman Empire had been expanding for 2 centuries, with an aura of invincibility built on conquest after conquest from Constantinople to Budapest. The long Turkish War had already claimed tens of thousands of lives across Central Europe for 3 years, as Habsburg and Ottoman forces clashed in a brutal struggle that turned entire regions into graveyards. But in the small principality of Wallachia, smaller than modern South Carolina, something was about to change that would shock the Islamic world. Michael the Brave wasn't supposed to be a warrior prince. Placed on the Wallachian throne as an Ottoman vassal in 1593, he was expected to be another puppet, sending tribute to Constantinople and keeping his Christian subjects obedient. The Ottomans had miscalculated. Within months, Michael had begun planning the unthinkable complete independence from the empire that had dominated the Balkans for generations. The spark came in November 1594, when Turkish creditors who had economically strangled Wallachia for decades were gathering in Bucharest for their annual collection of tribute. Michael struck first in a coordinated action across the country. Ottoman creditors and their guards were eliminated simultaneously in multiple cities. The message was clear: Wallachia would no longer kneel. But here's where it gets insane. Michael didn't just rebel. He declared a holy war. He sent envoys to the Pope, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to every Christian power, proclaiming himself the defender of Christendom's eastern frontier. For a ruler of a principality with barely 15,000 soldiers to challenge an empire spanning 3 continents was beyond audacious. It was considered suicidal by every military expert in Europe. Enter Sinan Pasha, the Ottoman Empire's iron fist. At 75 years old, He had crushed rebellions from Yemen to Hungary over 4 decades of military service. As Grand Vizier, second only to the Sultan himself, he commanded absolute authority over Ottoman armies. When news of Michael's rebellion reached Constantinople, Sinan didn't just mobilize an army. He assembled the largest force seen in the Balkans in decades. This wouldn't just be punishment, it would be an example to any other province considering defiance. The Ottoman war machine that crossed into Wallachia in August 1595 was a sight that made grown men flee their villages in terror. Contemporary accounts describe a column stretching for miles, 100,000 soldiers in total, though Sinan would deploy them in waves. The vanguard alone numbered between 12,000 and 40,000 elite troops. Behind them came the main force janissaries with their distinctive white caps. Sipahi cavalry in splendid armor. Artillery trains with bronze cannons that had breached the walls of countless fortresses. The logistics alone was staggering. Each day this army consumed tons of supplies. They brought engineers, bridge builders, siege specialists. This wasn't just an army. It was a mobile city devoted to destruction. Sinan Pasha commanded from a silk tent that required 50 men to erect, surrounded by his personal guard of 2,000 janissaries. His war council included Hassan Pasha, the empire's finest cavalry commander, and veterans of campaigns from Persia to Austria. Against this behemoth, Michael the Brave had assembled 15,000 defenders, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in composition and determination. These weren't frightened conscripts, they were men fighting for their homeland with nothing to lose. The corps consisted of 3,000 mercenaries, hardened veterans who had served in armies across Europe. Supporting them were 7,000 Wallachian infantry, armed with everything from muskets to farming implements transformed into weapons. The real surprise was Michael's cavalry, 5,000 horsemen, who knew every path, every stream, every hiding place in their homeland. But the Ottomans had made a fatal miscalculation about Michael's artillery. The Wallachian force had only 10 to 12 cannons. True. What Ottoman scouts missed was where these guns were positioned and who was manning them. Michael had recruited artillery specialists from Transylvania, men who understood trajectory and timing with mathematical precision. Each cannon was placed not for maximum range, but for maximum devastation at specific points the Ottomans would be forced to cross. Hidden in the forests near Călugăreni were the Sakli reserves under Albert Kirali, 3,000 mountain warriors who had fought Ottomans for generations. These men wouldn't enter battle immediately. Michael had given them specific instructions. Wait, watch, and strike only when the enemy was fully committed to the bridge crossing. Patience would be their weapon. This is when physics became Michael's ally. The terrain around Călugăreni was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. The Neajlov River, while not particularly wide, was surrounded by marshland that extended for hundreds of yards on either side. In August, after summer rains, this marsh was a treacherous mix of deep mud and hidden pools. A man in armor who left solid ground might never emerge. The single bridge crossing the Neajlov was perhaps 20 to 30 feet wide, enough for a merchant's cart. Catastrophic for an army. Any force crossing would be compressed into a narrow column. Perfect targets for concentrated artillery fire. But Sinan's scouts reported it as a minor obstacle. After all, Ottoman engineers had bridged the Danube itself, what was one small Romanian river. Then the killing ground revealed its true purpose through Michael's preparation. He had spent weeks studying this terrain with engineers, diverting small streams to create additional marshland, disguising the worst areas with rushes and branches. He knew that once an army committed to crossing the bridge,